So imagine a barren land without many large cities and a lot of unused space, occupied by mostly poorly educated people whose occupation is hard labor. Wow, nobody likes hard labor, right? And it was in poor working conditions too, including the presence of a very strict Catholic Church that's actually supplementing the current conditions. How great is that? So now picture Quebec, and now it is a very rich place with very kind francophones. Well, it wasn't necessarily always like that. That was old Quebec, at least before the Quiet Revolution. Well, now of course not all of Quebec was like this, especially in the large cities Montreal and Quebec, where business was really quite literally booming and people lived happy lives. Though life could be better, and the people of Quebec could have better relations with the federal government in Ottawa, so basically the rest of Canada. But the ruling government that was in charge, which was the Conservative Party, would not allow for these changes to be made, and preferred to root out for more traditional Catholic values. Alright, so at this time, the Quebec Church was called the Grand Noir, which translates to the bleak words of the Great Darkness, or l'année noire, which translates to the Black Years. Why do they call this time the Black Years? And why was the church so harsh about this time? This is because it had complete control over the education that the Quebec people received, and how the resources in Quebec would be used, kind of just having complete control over the people. This time was leading to the start of the Quiet Revolution. Before the Quiet Revolution, the leaders like Duplessis did not have the right intention for the province's education and resources. For example, one of the biggest stories is when Quebec was selling iron to foreign companies, usually American, for only 1 cent per ton of iron, which is pretty low by the way. To anyone that has an IQ over 0, you can clearly tell that Duplessis' leadership situation was either very drunk or they did not understand what he was doing. To sum up, foreign monopolies were exploiting Quebec's raw resources for what could be the easiest way to make a large profit without having to worry about paying too much. Also, utility companies that controlled the province's power and water supply were all private, which made it harder to make a provincial-wide utility service for all of Quebec. I wouldn't necessarily be surprised if you can't tell what Mr. Xavier is trying to draw right here, but we'll just move on from that. With the Federation of Canada in 1867, the province of Quebec was allowed to create its own education system. However, due to pressure from the Catholic Church and the head of churches, the clergy believed that they would be able to provide better teaching to young people without the government's quote-unquote interference. Because of this, there were thousands of different school boards with their own curriculums and own recognition for diplomas that were responsible for the running of schools. This created a large mess that needed urgent attention from the provincial government. Due to the provincial government largely ignoring its own education system, only 13% of French Canadians graduated in grade 11, when compared to the English Canadians with 36%. This was obviously very devastating to the French Canadians because it meant that they couldn't get decent jobs in their own province, meaning they had to leave their province for post-secondary education and couldn't express themselves as their own independent Quebecois people, because they are in a poor state, and poor people don't make good revolutionists or rebels. The basic info is now done, finally. On September 7, 1959, Maurice Duplessis, who was the Premier of Quebec at the time, died after a stroke when visiting the Iron Ore Company of Canada in Schefferville. Since it was not yet time for elections, the remaining days of the Conservative Party's rule in Quebec was serviced by Paul Sauvé until he died on January 4, 1960 of a coronary thrombosis. When Paul Sauvé took office after Duplessis' death, the 100-day revolution began. The 100-day revolution is the prelude of the Quiet Revolution, which brought change to the education and social system of Quebec, and resolved outstanding issues that had been left unresolved by the previous government. Sauvé worked to modernize the education system by increasing the funding that educational institutions in Quebec receive, and negotiated a deal with Ottawa to receive grants to open and fund new and present-run universities in Quebec, which would allow for the development and growth within the Canadian Francophone community. Unfortunately, the 100-day revolution ended just more than 100 days of Sauve's reign, cut short because he died. He was succeeded by Antonio Barrette, who mostly oversaw the continuation of Sauve's changes. He lost in the 1960 Quebec election, which brought along the beginning of the Quiet Revolution under the leadership of Jean Lesage. Mr. Lesage promised to revolutionize Quebec and make it an image of power and stability in Canada by strengthening the state and creating, basically in the most simplistic way, an ideal place for all current and future francophones living in Quebec. Before the Quiet Revolution, the Liberal Party adopted both neo-nationalist and liberal ideas in support of a strong and independent Quebec that would set itself apart from Canada. In the early years of the Revolution, the Liberal Party put their new ideas into place and gained almost complete control over the province. Premier Lesage took control over the social, health, and all education entities within the province of Quebec, which allowed for thousands of jobs to be created for all of the francophones. Along with continuing the secularization of the province, the provincial government created several crown corporations, with most notable being the creation of Hydro-Quebec, where French was made the language of the workplace. When the experience was gained, many Quebecois used their new experience to their own advantage and created private companies that would collaborate with Quebec Inc., an organization or alliance of the largest companies in Quebec. In the 1960s, the Western world was going through a massive change. Industrialization was booming, and the world was becoming heavily urbanized after the end of World War II. In order to not be overwhelmed by the rapid change, the leaders of Quebec knew that they needed to greatly modernize just like the rest of the world. In order to modernize, secularize, and take control of the vital services in Quebec, the Lesage government required more taxes and heavy support. A new type of middle class began to emerge, and were completely on board with the Liberal Party, which was why we were able to get plenty of changes done. The increased taxes and support allowed Quebec to undermine the Catholic Church, and emerged out as an urban society, no longer being the old, rural, and church-controlled state that it was before. Believe it or not, the Quiet Revolution is still happening today. Though the bulk of the revolution occurred in the 1960s to 70s, there are still independence movements in Quebec today, and Quexit, which is Brexit but Quebec edition, is still very much in thought. Every chance for economic growth is taken advantage of, and Quebec is working towards making its own strong state, unlike any other province in Canada, and you have no choice but to learn the French language, and the federal government of Canada must work with the province of Quebec in order to get laws passed. The province of Quebec has its own national assembly and works as like a second federal government, which means that the premier almost has the same amount of power that the federal government has over Canada. In today's case, the francophones in Quebec have a ton of power over their own people.